Okay, great. Well, I see the numbers starting to level off, and we might as well get started. Great to see everyone. My name is Matthew Eby, and I'm the founder and CEO of First Street, the company that also makes Risk Factor, which is why you see the background on both logos with us. And I'm joined today with Dr. Jeremy Porter, our head of climate implications, and Dr. Ed Kearns, our Chief Science Officer at First Street. So today we are going to be walking through the methodological approaches to creating climate models and creating models that allow you to quantify risk at a property level and kind of getting into the details there. But before we kick off with the slides, some general housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will send it out to everyone who is on this webinar and anyone who misses it, but registered so that they can watch in the end. So you don't need to take serious notes. You'll be able to get it and find it after and rewatch if you're interested. But more importantly, at the bottom of your screen, please feel free to ask questions. We have folks that will be able to answer them live as we're going through. And then we'll also pull out questions from the Q&A section to just answer as we're going live, so we have more of a free conversation about these things. So if there's something you'd like us to answer, please by all means give a question, and then we'll get to it as we go through the different slides. But what you can expect today is a general conversation on climate models, physics-based models, statistical models, AI, things like that are all going into the climate conversation right now, and then what is and what is not appropriate for different types of uses. And then finally, we'll also get into some regulatory issues that have come up or compliance questions that folks are going to have to respond to and what models make the most sense for that. So it'll be a great topic to discuss on multiple fronts. And with that, I would love to pass it off to Dr. Kearns to kick us off.
All right, thank you, Matt. Go ahead and share my screen here. We have a few slides. There we go. All right, can everybody see my screen okay? They look good?
You always look good, Ed.
All right, even at my advanced age, good to know. So yeah, thank you for joining today. So today we'll be talking about First Street's climate risk models. This is going to be a high-level overview of how we're creating these models and why, and we'll explain some of the differences. You know, in this emerging marketplace right now for climate risk information, there's all sorts of different models out there. There's a lot of confusion about how these models should or shouldn't be used, and so we'll talk a lot about that today. The way that we have created our risk models at First Street, that we are focused on building accurate models, establishing trust in those models, and being able to resolve each individual asset, each individual property in the United States right now. So from the get-go, we have built these models with those purposes in mind. We lean on physics-based deterministic models because that gives us the most confidence in the results, and that allows us to create property level statistics in a way that it's just very difficult to do any other way. So there's a gap in the information that's available right now for climate risk. If you've been trying to find this kind of information, you will have noticed that the U.S. government, the science agencies such as NOAA, NASA, USGS, and others have been creating these kind of general risk and climate products for a while, but they don't get very specific. They have a very hard time getting down to the individual property level or individual business level or building level. They stop at county level or above. So there's a gap between what the federal government's providing right now and what the need is. And the need comes from individuals, such as many of you on here. It comes from realtors. It comes from companies. It comes from banks. It comes from other federal agencies, such as the U.S. Treasury and FHFA and GSEs like Fannie and Freddie that are looking at individual mortgages. So they need asset-specific, property-specific information. And so there's an emerging sector that's growing for property-specific information, and the private sector is filling that gap. And First Street is part of that community. And we are creating these products to be very, very specific, to make it very, very personal, so that you can go building by building on your property for you or your business and be able to understand what the risk is today and what it's going to be in 30 years. So we are assessing every property in the United States right now. It's about 148 million properties. That also includes public lands, and that includes common grounds, and that includes roads. So we also we have extended our ability to quantify this risk across the landscape to other important infrastructure and government and public lands as well. With that, we can also start to understand how climate change is going to be impacting our populations, our jobs, demographic shifts, and how property values are going to be changing, no matter where they are. So to do this, when we're creating these risk models, we also want to make sure that these models are trusted. So as scientists, we are submitting these. We submit these models and the methodologies for peer review in scientific journals. They get reviewed by other scientists and go back and forth to make sure that they're well described and valid, and then they get published in scientific journals that we can share with anybody that's interested in our work. And then we validate. We're always validating results against real-world events as they happen. Unfortunately, there's a lot of extreme weather continues to occur, but it's predictable, and then we validate our models against those new occurrences. So if you've seen riskfactor.com before, we've talked about that. You'll see that again a little bit on one of the slides. But what you don't see is that we're also delivering these data in bulk to some large banks, to federal agencies, in different ways, so that they can also use these data in bulk to do risk assessments and to accomplish their missions as well. So we create data, but we can use it for many, many use cases. This is very complicated. Yes.
Ed, I'll jump in. There's two questions that I think are really helpful here that just came in. One is, can you talk a little bit about the other entities that we collaborate with, in particular government agencies that we've worked with on developing these models or have gotten advice from on developing the model, and then a little bit on what property level data we get outside of the Lightbox offerings.
Outside of Lightbox. Okay, so for the first one, so with federal agencies, we've had informal relationships with many of them, including USGS and NOAA. We have a formal relationship with NASA. We signed a Space Act agreement with NASA to collaborate on these kinds of products. And then as far as the property level information outside of Lightbox, if you're talking about I don't know, Jeremy, if you could clarify, is it about what the property characteristics are coming from, or which?
And really, the questions around building specific information. A lot of the stuff that we get around buildings that don't come directly from Lightbox are things like building footprints, although those are integrated into that process also. But we're working with direct parcel locations, building locations, and then we have a lot of information around all of the properties themselves. We have complemented that data in the past with government sources like the National Structures Inventory Database and some of those other databases to help us understand where we may have missing data from the county assessor's offices to help impute some of that data. So it really is a collaborative process, but most of it comes from the Lightbox data source.
Right, thank you. And the other additional data set that we use for our wildfire assessments comes from the USDA. It's the so-called NATE data, the National Agricultural Imaging Program. I think I got that acronym right. So we use that for computing the defensible space around every rooftop in America too, so we can do that building-specific assessment of wildfire risk. That'd be another data source we use. Okay. All right. So with this emphasis on transparency and reproducibility on this slide, that not trying to get you to read all of this. But if you want to get into the gory details of any of our models, this is available on our website. You can click through to all the different methodologies. We have some methodology documents that are written at a high level. Others that are at the scientific level get pretty technical pretty fast. But the idea here is that yes, if you're going to be using our models, if you're a regulator or you're being regulated on climate risk. that our processes and our methods are discoverable, they are understandable, so you can understand every little piece of these. This is very, very important. In future webinars, we will dive in deep on these different models for flood, air quality, wildfire, wind, extreme heat, and then climate implications. Jeremy and his team are working on a lot of new stuff with climate implications. And what we mean by climate implications are other socioeconomic quantities that are based upon these other physical risk models that actually drive these changes in populations or demographics. And so there's a lot of interesting work that Jeremy's leading that you'll hear about in future webinars as well. So at First Street, we're using climate models. They're so-called CMIP6 climate models. There's a large collection of these. You've heard about them in other venues probably. They're written about in the press quite a bit. The international science community has collaborated to create this set of models based upon different carbon scenarios that everybody agreed upon that we were going to model. So this is the 6th version of this. That's why it's called the Climate Model Intercomparison Project number 6, or CMIP6. These are global models. These models are simulating climate around the globe. It's very computationally intensive, and so the resolution of those computer models is pretty coarse. About 100 kilometers, that's about 60 miles, would be one pixel, one number among all the others in the model output. So a lot of people struggle with how to use those models well. And so at First Street, what we do is we use those models not directly, and I'll talk more about that in a second if you want to try to use them directly, but we use those models as inputs to our physically based models. So we'll take those, for example, for precipitation that's in this figure here. We'll use the precipitation information from the climate models as a way of driving our high resolution hydraulic flood model, so we can actually get down to a 3-meter resolution to actually where the water is moving across the ground. It's very risky if you're going to try to take the climate model outputs directly and try to discern, what's going to be happening at your location, at your specific house or business from those climate models directly. So instead, using those more coarse inputs as those more coarse outputs from the climate models as inputs to physically based models allows us to increase the resolution in a very informed way, in a scientifically sound way, by leaning on the physics in the model to actually drive that resolution up for us as well. This is a schematic showing what I'm talking about when I say that you don't want to use those models directly. So at the topmost figure here, those are 10-kilometer pixels that you're seeing on there. That's similar to what you're seeing coming out of a precipitation model from a general circulation model, a climate model, kind of coarse resolution. And as you're getting further and further down in this figure, yes, you can get a number if you just take a mathematical average or literally interpolate what that number is. But is that number going to be useful? You're not adding any additional information. You're not making an informed choice of what that higher resolution number is going to be. And so while there are a lot of offerings out there that will give you a number for any spot on Earth for what the climate risk is, but if they're based upon these kinds of uninformed downscaling, you don't have a lot of faith in what that number is. It's not going to be very specific for your location. And that, of course, is our goal, is to get very, very specific information for every building on Earth.
Yeah, and I think just on that point, it's just worth reiterating on the last slide, the idea here is that from the global climate models, you can think of these things as very big grid cells that give you an answer. So as you can see in this top right image, those darker squares, those are 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer squares. So everything within that is what will be applied the same information. So for this on a precipitation model, whether it's more likely to rain or less likely to rain. And what we're seeing a lot in market are people are looking for solutions globally. And when you're looking for a global solution, it is not possible to spend the resources and time to create the specific physics-based models that Ed's going to get into, or was just talking about with our model in the US in every single country. So what you end up doing to try and get to an answer is taking these input models, the CMIP6 models, and downscaling them. So that 10-kilometer grid then gets mashed together to then create a more likely output on our smaller output, a more granular output at a 5-kilometer, and then done again at a 1-kilometer. And it goes all the way down until you get to a property level answer. But that property level answer is effectively what was driven off of a 10-kilometer answer. And so the idea that you have property differentiation within these types of models and these global model offerings is just not possible. It's possible to get an answer, as Ed was saying, but it's not an accurate answer. And that's the problem that we see in market today, is that these global offerings are great in the sense of giving you relative answers, but when you're trying to get property specific answers, that's when they don't stand up. So this use is appropriate in certain situations, but it's not when you're trying to get to what is happening to this specific building, which is the driver of a majority of decisions of what people are trying to answer. Do I have a disclosure requirement around a material financial risk that I should talk about with my shareholders? Well, this is not how you would get to that type of answer. Or do I have a general risk in this region? Absolutely appropriate to look at this data to then understand what may or may not be at risk, or relative risk, which is a lot of the metrics you might see, where it's this property has more risk than these properties 10 kilometers away. So it's just really important to think about the appropriate uses of models when you're trying to get to which type of answer that you're looking to actually answer.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I'll be talking. We were talking about statistically based models, and for purposes of this discussion, we'll lump in statistically based machine learning, artificial intelligence, all kind of into that classification of that kind of model. And they have their place. They have a lot of great things about them. We all use them in lots of different ways. There's some advantages. The cost of running a statistically based model is much cheaper than a physically based model. It doesn't require as much computation, and they require time to train and to create. But then after that, actually deploying them and using them is very fast and cheap. It's usually, you're always able to create output. You'll get numbers out. It depends how good the model is, but how well you can trust them. Some of the newer models, particularly artificial intelligence, is getting a lot of press lately, and for very good reason. It's remarkable technology, and they can find relationships among data that are otherwise very hard to discern. So for many things, particularly like socioeconomic applications, they have a lot of uses. If you can write down the answer though to the equations with paper and pen for a physics-based model, that is then you understand the relationships before you even start to use them, right? So it's one of the strengths of the physically based models. But you can't always write down the equations governing the phenomena that you're trying to model. In those cases, statistically based models are a great choice. The scaling that like Matt was just talking about, being able to go from global, to a more local, it is possible. You have to be careful about how it's done, as we were just talking about. But if you've got the right kind of training data, you can cross scales. And expertise. Usually a subject matter expert isn't required to train and deploy these models. You need to have somebody who's very good at statistics and very good at the technology, but not necessarily an expert in climate or in meteorology or in oceanography or whatever you're trying to model. So if you're trying to use those for modeling physical climate risk, particularly at the asset level, building specific physical climate risk, there's some hurdles, there's some obstacles in using these kinds of models. The first is the trust. If you can explain how the answer was created, this is particularly true for things like artificial intelligence, which is a black box algorithm that even the people that create these algorithms have a hard time understanding why they work so well. It makes it an amazing technology, but not so great when you're trying to explain to regulators how you got to the answer for your company, right? So that trust is an issue. With other kinds of machine learning, it's a little bit easier, but still, you still have to be able to explain those answers to somebody that needs them. You've often heard about AI hallucinating. This is a common term in a lot of popular media now too. When AI kind of goes astray for unknown reasons, we don't understand all the reasons why that happens. But if you're trying to make climate predictions that have big financial consequences, you want to be able to trust, and you want to make sure that your models are not hallucinating. That's for sure. For climate in particular. So there's been a lot of work recently on weather prediction and artificial intelligence that is absolutely amazing results that are starting to come out from the weather modeling community. It is going to be transformative. That is fantastic. However, the way that those models work is that they are learning from observations of the atmosphere and the ocean today, and they're learning the AI models are learning the physics from the observations today, and the models are only as good as the observations are. That is very, very clear. And you've heard about how biases in data can be baked into different AI models. Oh, that's absolutely true. That's true for the physical climate as well. Now, one of the things is, of course, we don't have any observations of future climate to train these statistical models on. So we don't even have, while we have observations of today's climate, we don't have observations of tomorrow's climate. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Where there's limited data or event types in particular with limited data, for example, Cat 5 hurricanes, right? A very damaging event. There have only been like 4 or 5 landfalling Cat 5 hurricanes in the US in all of history, right? So it is a rare event. It is very hard statistically to represent those rare events. A whole branch of mathematics has been developed in order to try to help with that. But it is a big limitation on the statistical approach if you're trying to model events that are rare or have never been seen before. And that's what we're facing with climate change. Those rare events are becoming more and more common. And then the resolution of your models, again, you have to be very careful about how you're going from large scale to downscale. If you're not bringing in new information, as Matt was describing previously, you're creating false precision. You're getting a number, but it's not truly representative of what the conditions are at that location. So you have to be very, very careful if you are doing that.
Hey Ed, there's 2 questions that came in. One, can you talk a little bit about the climate models we use and how we get to the downscale climate models? Are we using external downscalers, or are we doing that in-house?
We are using NASA's downscaled model data from the CMIP6 models. It's called NASA NEX, NEX. They're supporting the scientific community by using well-established methods to downscale the CMIP6 models and presenting them as open data to the entire scientific community. So we are using NASA's downscaled data.
And the second question, I'll just follow up because you mentioned it earlier. There's a question around some of the downstream implications to using the modeling approach that we're using. We have published papers on the impact of localized flooding risk on demographic shifts, and we actually published a paper in Nature Communications at the end of the year that actually showed for the first time that there is a population signal associated with localized flood risk when you look at residential mobility patterns within cities. As Ed mentioned, we're currently building out other products where we're linking some of those demographic changes back to things like property value risk, tax revenue implications, demographic change in terms of who can afford to move out, who ends up in the communities, how does that change the composition of the communities, and then downstream, what does that mean for commercial viability and commercial implications? So I just wanted to follow up on that point. It came across in Q&A, but those are some of the implications projects that we build off of these physically based risk models that Ed's discussing.
Thanks, Jeremy. So let me talk a little bit about how we're rolling with our physics-based deterministic models. So these, again, are models for flood, wildfire, and wind that are looking at how those perils actually evolve on the Earth's surface, We can write down the equations that govern these, and then we can model those equations inside a computer model. We really like doing this with the trust because if we're going to be scaling this and looking 30 years into the future, we have to be able to trust those results are going to hold up in a climate change in the future. And one thing that we are certain of, that the physics today is going to be the same as physics 30 years from today, right? So while we're scaling the inputs to those models for the future, so we can try to understand what the future is going to look like, this can be the same physics in the future. If those models are properly representing flood, wildfire, and wind today, we have confidence that they are going to represent them in the future, given the right inputs. So that's a major reason why we are doing this. It reduces some of the problems that we have with those very rare events, right? Because and we've all heard this with a lot of the increased rainfall flooding that's happened in the U.S. People say, "Oh gosh, it never rained this hard before. We didn't flood ever before, so now we're surprised when we had this big flood event," right? Unfortunately, we hear that story every year in multiple places across the U.S., right? If you're just basing your answer on what has happened in the past, you're not going to get the right answer. But based on with these physically based models, we can say, yeah, what if it does rain that hard? And if it does, and we know it is going to be raining harder in the future, then we can say, yes, we can expect flooding in areas that have not flooded before. So this is a great way of reducing those limitations on the observed data. The resolution, being able to go to the property-specific resolution, which again is one of our primary goals, so we can actually differentiate house to house. So your neighbor's house, your house, neighbor on the other side, you're all going to actually have different risk. And so being able to discern that by using these kinds of models allows us to get the kind of very high resolution down to 3-meter resolution that's necessary for flood, for example, in order to get that differentiation, which really matters across any collection of assets or within a neighborhood or at your own house or business. Validating the models, because they've been based on physical principles, have been published, have been well studied. There's the long history to the kind of solutions that these models, physically based models, are creating. There's what we call deterministic. You provide the same inputs, you get the same outputs, right? So it's repeatable, it's demonstrable. This is one of the standards in science that we adhere to, and it allows us to do very confident validation in our work. And then the uncertainties that are inherent in any kind of work like this, any kind of modeling work, the different pieces of the model's outputs, we can figure out what the accuracy and precision are, and we can carry those through in the overall calculations of risk, so that we can convey to the user, how much trust to put into those probabilistic numbers that were coming out for expectation for future flood, for future wildfire, and for future wind. So why aren't a lot of other people taking the same approach that First Street does? Because we're obviously publishing all of our methods. So if anybody wanted to do what we're doing, they would know how, right? Because we've put the answer out there. There's a number of reasons. Number one, it's very costly to do this. Over the last 7 years, we spent over $35 million. And that's with, when we're very grateful for AWS support. We've got some credits from them also too, to do some of these computations on the cloud. And we've been focused on the US only. So it is very costly and very time intensive, right? So it takes, one of the reasons it's so costly, yeah, the compute is expense, because it takes a lot of time to compute at this kind of resolution, those kinds of physically based models. It is just, turning that crank is very laborious. It takes a lot of calculations to arrive at the accurate answers. So a lot of people don't want to go through this much effort, but we do, because the output is so valuable. You do require subject matter expertise. So we're working with the PowerGens Consortium for wildfire, some of the nation's best wildfire experts, because we need their expertise in order to develop these models and create these models in the way that we are. With flood, the same. We have in-house flood experts that know the physics inside and out, know the hydrology inside and out, and can understand how the models are working and make sure that the quality is very high. and you can't just simply scale and like say, oh, okay, we did the US today, let's just do the whole world tomorrow. No, it is, we have to go methodically, place by place, country by country, region by region, in order to build these kinds of models. It is very difficult to scale these out across very, very large areas. Going across US, as we said, was a very, very enormously costly enterprise to do this. We were very successful in doing it. It took a lot of effort, but yes, it is not a simple thing to scale, and that again stops a lot of people from doing this. Data, the volumes of data. You know, if you're used to and it's comfortable working with hundreds of terabytes worth of data, that is a big barrier for a lot of organizations. At First Street, we're very good with working with large volumes of data, and we've got the infrastructure both on-prem and on AWS to do that. So again, one of the things that stops a lot of people, but does not stop us at First Street. We're fearless with data, right, Jeremy? Yes. And the market. When we got started doing this, when we first released the first flood risk products back in June 2020, the market for the use of this information didn't really exist. It was just emerging. Now, 4 years later, it's more well defined. And now there's a lot of private companies, like I said, are filling this space between the government and the need for this kind of very specific information. And there are some companies that are just trying to get any information out there, and they're trying to move fast. And to do the physically based modeling approach is one thing that you just can't skimp on. You just can't rush it. You have to be very methodical and move through it carefully. And that's what we've done at First Street.
Hey, Ed, one question that we have, but I think it's very relevant to what you just went through on the last 4 slides here is what is the kind of confidence interval difference between these higher resolution physics-based deterministic models and the probabilistic statistical models? Like, what kind of uncertainty are we talking about between the two, or kind of what is the general idea of the difference between them?
It varies, and I hate to say it depends, but yes, so it does depend. For something like our flood model, which is at 3-meter resolution, the kind of difference is because we can resolve flooding on a property. Like for example, maybe a creek on a property that doesn't intersect with the house normally, and under the flood conditions won't. A statistical method may assume that it is going to touch that. So when you start to get to those kinds of situations where a statistical model doesn't understand that there may be a flood protection feature, or there may be a very severe grade there that will prevent the water from reaching the other side of the property or reaching that house. Without that kind of resolution, you just can't get the right answer. Yeah. Yeah, so it may be right for 80% of the properties, but it's going to be wrong for the other 20. And so we want to try to be right for as many properties as we can.
And then similarly, on the downscaling side, there's a question here around that we are saying that we're using the NASA Next GDP CMIP6 data as our input for our models. But how do we deal with the uncertainties mentioned regarding the statistical downscaling? Which was kind of you were starting to talk about at the beginning about our models as an input. So I think it might just be worth hitting on that again and just explaining how you can use it as an input versus as a model.
Yeah, so using the NASA Next GDP data as our inputs, there's always going to be uncertainties associated with any model output. We use a couple of different techniques to deal with that. One is to look at ensembles of these models. So we're not looking at any one particular climate model, we're taking groups of them. You may be familiar with this kind of approach from hurricane forecasting. When you see on the TV or in the forecast maps that there's lots of different possible paths that different models have said, and the forecaster is taking this group of models, this group of tracks, an ensemble of tracks, and using them to find out what the most likely track is going to be. We use similar kind of approaches of taking multiple models in order to drive down some of that uncertainty in both the spatial and the temporal resolution of those models. That's probably the simplest answer that I have right now, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I said, I'd come back to the AI approach. There's been a subject in the news lately about exceptional heat. So for the last 18 months or so, the global surface temperature, in particular sea surface temperature in the North Atlantic Ocean in particular, had been warmer than we've ever seen before. So I'm a PhD oceanographer. This is absolutely amazing. We've never seen something like this before. So for the last, like I said, 18 months, the ocean surface has been warmer than ever seen in human history. So from a physics standpoint, and as scientists, we're still trying to figure out exactly why this is. There's a couple of hypotheses that we're testing out right now about why this is. But in terms of training a climate model, this is another reason why we don't prefer to use AI for these kinds of things, because if you're training AI off the historical records, it's never going to predict such a thing because it didn't exist in the past. And if it doesn't exist in the data, it can't discern it. So, this is a great real world example of something with climate that changes are happening that we've never seen before. And it's just another reason why we're trusting the physics and leaning on the physics rather than only the data, because we're seeing things happening, whether it's sea surface temperatures, whether it's heavy rainfalls, whether it's hurricane tracks, things that we've never seen before are starting to happen with very regularly with climate change impacts, and that's what we're trying to resolve. So how do these physics-based deterministic models that I'm talking about, how do they work? So if we know the physics, we can estimate how to solve those equations governing that phenomena in computer code, and we run that in the computer based upon drivers. In the case of flood, it's going to be driven by rainfall and river flows and the land surface type and a whole bunch of other variables that control where the water is going to move across the land surface. But that's what we actually are simulating is how water, if you put water on the Earth's surface, how is it going to move? Where is it going to go? How deep is the water going to be on the land surface? What's the expectation? And so we do this at 3-meter resolution. So we can, as you can see in this example, you can get flooding in the street, but no flooding up where the houses are, or you can get flooding in the public park that you see in the middle of this. That was probably placed there because it floods, right? A lot of public parks are placed in places that are inappropriate to build housing, for example, or businesses. So by actually looking at how that peril, whether it's wildfire, whether it's flood, how that actually evolves across the Earth's surface, how it impacts homes, how it impacts the terrain, is how that physically based models work. And that's, again, you can just kind of take a guess at how much calculation goes in to be able to do this at 3-meter resolution across the entire United States. It does take a lot of computation in order to do this. So for these 3 types of models I was just mentioning, so for flood, and again, we're not going to do a deep dive on these today, but we will get into these in future webinars into the goriest of details. Our flood model is leveraging a hydraulic model called LISFlood, which is an open source solution for how water moves across the land surface. And we combine riverine, rainfall, storm surge, and tidal flood components into that one model. And so by bringing these together as a compound flood model, you don't have to worry about the different components, but you'll just understand what the likelihood is of having a certain depth of water at any place in the US. Our wildfire model leverages a fire behavior model called Elm Fire, written by Dr. Chris Lautenberger, who we work with. And in that case, we're doing what we call a Monte Carlo simulation. So basically, we take many, many wildfires, millions and millions of wildfires. We simulate them across the land surface, and we build up estimates of burn probability and the flame length, possible flame length at 30 meters resolution across the entire landscape of the US. And so in order to see how it's going to be impacting homes, particularly in those areas that's called the wildland urban interface or the WUI. These are areas that are outside the urban areas and starting to build into the wildlands, where you see a lot of fire damage historically. We're doing the simulation so we can assess the risk to homes in those areas in particular. With wind, we have this situation I was talking about before with rare events, right? So hurricanes are not that common, and so we don't have a great deal of storms to study. So we use synthetic hurricanes. So these are hurricanes based on Dr. Kerry Emanuel's work from MIT, by creating other similar storms based on the same kind of historical storm events, but being able to project them forward into the future with climate change, understand how they're going to be changing. We can go from having a few dozen storms to study to having over 50,000 storms to study. And we can start to do, in a similar kind of way, build up a probabilistic estimate of what the wind damage is likely to be in different parts of the country as well. And again, all these methodologies are online. They're in peer-reviewed literature, and we will be doing deeper dives and future webinars on these. So if any of these in particular interest you, please stay tuned. Now, we talked about the inputs to these models are so important, and they are. And so we lean heavily upon U.S. Government open data from NOAA, from NASA, from FEMA, from the USGS, from the U.S. Forest Service. And many of them are listed here, and I won't go through this long list. But it's satellite data, it's surface observations, it's different kinds of LiDAR measurements for elevation, for example. There is a lot of data, and we're very, very thankful that these open data programs are providing these, and it allows us to take these and recast them through our physically based models as it's an integrated product. We're integrating these into the answer that you want, which is what is your climate risk at your location. Now, there are times where those government inputs, I call it falling short. There's some aspect of those government inputs that aren't capturing what we're trying to measure. So for example, rainfall. A well-known issue is that NOAA's rainfall climatology, it's called Atlas 14. It assumes stationarity, which means that it assumes that the past is going to be like the future, and that the recent years are the same as it was in the early 1900s. Okay, and so NOAA's known about this problem for a while. They do have funding now from Congress to update their atlas. So we applaud that. We support that. That's fantastic. But we couldn't wait for 5 years for NOAA to finish its work before we could get our models out. So we used the NOAA methodology, and we used other NOAA data to calculate our own rainfall climatology looking at the last 30 years, because we know that there's been a shift in how hard rain is falling. As the air gets warmer, you can put more water vapor into it. If it holds more water vapor, the rainfalls are heavier. And we've all experienced these in our daily lives. Rainfalls are getting heavier. So we calculated that ourselves. We use that as the input to our flood model, as one of the inputs to our flood model, because we want to be able to resolve that additional risk that heavier rainfalls are already imposing on our climate risk today, and is going to continue in the future. And once NOAA is finished with their work and Atlas 15, as we're calling it, comes out and it's got the climate adjustments in there, we'll use that as our inputs. So other data sets that we've created. Flood adaptation features. So there's lots of features across the US that protect communities, that protect homes, that protect businesses from flood. There's only some of them that are in the Army Corps of Engineers levee database. So we literally sent people out to go walk into offices and walk the tops of levees and collect information on those flood adaptation features that exist in the built environment to protect homes today. And we have amassed a database of over 23,000 such adaptation features. And we use those because we want to have an accurate depiction of what the risk is for homes. And if your home is in an area that's protected by one of these features, and our model is protected up to the design spec of that feature. For wildfire, we had to create some new fuel estimates, wildfire fuel estimates, so basically vegetation, because the U.S. Forest Service's land fire database, which is a fantastic fuels database, within those wildland urban interface communities, within the WUI communities, they had a lot of areas that were designated as non-burnable areas, and we realized no, they do burn, and so we had to reclassify some of those more urban areas as burnable fuel. So we did our own conversion for that. For wildfire mitigation, as prescribed burns are executed, as forest thinning occurs, as fire breaks are dug to protect communities, we also build those into our fuel layers as well. Land fire typically is not updated annually. They actually last year they did do an update, which is fantastic, but we can't count on them doing it annually. So we're doing our own annual updates to make sure that we're capturing all those things that people have been doing to reduce wildfire risk so that the model results are accurate. And then surface roughness when it comes to wind events, that really matters about whether you're in a layer of turbulence or you're sticking above the layer of turbulence. For the surface roughness, about the damage that the wind is going to cause to your roof or to your building. And again, so we augment that with additional information on top of what USGS already has. So in any cases that we're creating our own inputs, we publish those results. We tell everybody how we're doing it. We go to scientific meetings and describe it so everybody can understand what we're doing. And if they've got any comments on that, of course, we can receive those. And with that, Matt, I'm about talked out talking all the technical stuff. Do you want to take it from here?
Sure, happy to dig in. And so with all of the stuff that Dr. Kearns was just bringing us through, how does this work? Well, we build all of this data so that people will use it. And we are happy to report that there is a number of groups that use it, from the federal government to top banks to investors and GSEs and corporations themselves and consultants that leverage it. So just a few of our customers listed here, but this is the idea, is that this data gets used, that you understand the actual details that go into these models, why there's so much effort into the transparency, methodological approaches, these physics-based deterministic models, so that you can get to asset level risk and really understand the results so that you can then either make your own personal decision or optimize your business decisions. And so outside of that, it isn't just these customers. On the next slide, you'll just see that there's a lot of reports that come out with this information. So there's everything from formal reports from the White House and US Treasury and CBO to a blog post that came out from the Federal Reserve yesterday that was leveraging our data. So our products are also, and our data is also used by federal agencies and leveraged in federal reports themselves. But if you go to the next slide, I think where people most know us for is not only the reports that we create, but we go from these top customers and institutional investors and everything and regulators themselves all the way down to the individual. That's why we're the country's leading climate risk integration partner. We provide APIs and access so that when someone's on Realtor.com or Redfin or Homes.com, or they're looking in the Allstate app, or they're trying to find insurance from American Family, these are the types of places where you can find our information to make informed decisions. So everything from multi-$100 billion decisions down to what is the most important decision for a lot of us with our most valuable asset, investing in our home. So this is the importance of having the right data, the right methodological approach to then decide where you might live or what you might be buying or how your business should be operating to understand and quantify risk overall. And if you go to the next slide, Ed, this is really, really important, as there's also been a whole bunch of changes happening from a regulatory perspective. And so there are three new major regulations that have come out that are mandating corporations to disclose material financial risk caused by climate change. There are two different types of disclosures. There are emissions-based disclosures, which is not something that we do. And then there's financial risk-related disclosures on the physical aspects of climate change. So these are the elements that we do and that we do provide data for. And so when you look on the California regulation, there are two bills, but one of the bills specifically pertains to the type of data that we provide. So Senate Bill 261, that was approved by Governor Newsom in October of last year, is mandating that any company, whether it's private or public, and they have over $500 million in revenues on a given year, will have to report on their physical material financial risk. So the only way to actually be able to have a true answer on that is by looking at your individual assets, the actual structures that your company operates out of, and looking at your supply chain, the structures of your supply chain that feed in to the actual company operations, and understanding what the likelihood is for there to be damage, direct damage to those structures that you own. But really, more importantly, are these indirect consequences. So what happens if your office is shut down for a week because there was a major flooding event or a major hurricane? What happens if the labor force isn't available because the air quality doesn't allow them to actually build the buildings that you have as a construction company? What happens if the widgets that you get sent to your factory don't come because the supply chain is actually blocked from a flooding event or roads being impassable? These are the types of things that you need to run scenarios on. And if you look at those statistical models we were talking about at the beginning, they will provide you an answer, but the answer could be very, very wrong. And that's where you need to have an understanding of the methodological approach, the resolution that applies to it, and the actual outputs that you can trust for these things. This is very similar to the SEC rule that just happened on March 6th. So we're about 3 weeks out now from this rule being put into place. And this one is a little more nuanced on who has to report first. But what are called large accelerated filers are the first ones that will have to report in 2025. So now this year, everyone needs to start understanding this data and how it applies to their business. Same concept here around what is at risk for my structure? What are the indirect costs? What are the direct costs? And is this a material risk to my business? That materiality idea is the most important thing to understand, because in your annual report, you then need to have confidence that your CFO, your CEO can sign off on this, but also that you can use this data to optimize your business outputs, and really reduce risks. So that's where our data comes in and really empowers all of these companies to start reporting on it. So you saw the list of our current customers. That's growing day in and day out, because more and more people now need to understand this risk, not only from a regulatory perspective, because they realize the value and the impact that it can have from the operational side and the actual profitability of a business when you're talking about very, very material things like inability to operate your manufacturing facility, your office, or whatever it might be. And then lastly is the European Commission rule with CSRD that has been out for quite some time now, but is a longer lead on when you'll actually have to report. So impacting many companies, lots of them now starting to understand, from about an estimated 50,000 companies impacted, but what do we have to do? And that's more of a 4-year phased rollout, but still you need to acquire, understand, and start thinking about these things over time with the same concept of what is the right model, what is the right methodological approach for these disclosures that we're going to give. So there's a huge amount of demand coming in, and that's why we wanted to spend some time today to really talk about these models and these methodological approaches and why they're so different from each other. Because when you, at the end of the day, are the one that are looking to actually report on these risks, you need to understand what's under the hood, and you need to understand the appropriate and inappropriate uses of these different types of models. And if you'll go to the next slide, is our last slide here, where we are here to help. And so this is obviously not the easiest stuff to understand. We've been working at it for years and years, and spending a lot of money and time thinking about this with the world's best experts, such as Dr. Porter and Dr. Kearns, as well as our deep bench of partners that have helped us build all of these models and really quantify risk for every structure in the country. So if you're reporting on this, or you're trying to understand risk for your company and what you do day in, day out, we're here to help. We are the data provider, the leading data provider in the country, and that is simply because of the methodological underpinnings that we have in the peer review process and the transparent approaches that we've taken. So if you're interested in any of that, please feel free to reach out to us at bd@firststreet.org. That's for business development, for us to help find a way on how we can partner with you. We can provide bulk data, which is how a number of our partners access it, which is literally every property in the country we provide to you as a data file for you to model your own risk. We can match custom pulls, whether it's tens of properties that we can match up if you give us the addresses, to tens of millions of properties. There's 145 million properties in the country, and we have all of them quantified. And so we can do those match pulls, and then we can tell you about your portfolio risk, as I was just talking about, from the structures themselves to then talk about things like your supply chain and indirect risks that may impact your business. And then lastly, we have our API available, whether that's for integrations like you see on realtor.com and Redfin and homes.com, like I was talking about, or whether that's for integration into overall business tools and analysis that you're doing internally, so that you can bring all of this to data together and really look at it in a holistic way with other data sources. So that's the three different ways that we provide our data. We are really excited to work with a number of you to try and understand not only your business risk and how to de-risk those things, but also to help you report on these things that may happen. And with that, I think we can see if there are any other questions, as we have about 4 minutes left before we run at the top of the hour. So I'll just kind of scroll through and see if there's an interesting one, or Jeremy, if you have one on the top of your, or the tip of your tongue, we can also flip it over to you.
I've been responding to questions like crazy. I probably responded to about 40 of them at this point. I think, Ed, there's a lot of questions about our adaptation database. And so on the one hand, where does the adaptation database come from? How do we integrate it into our model? How can people gain access to that kind of data as part of our offerings? But we've had like 5 or 6 questions about that.
So most of that data comes from local authorities that have built and maintained those features. Like I said, we sent out people to literally knock on doors and find this information, because a lot of time it wasn't available on some government website. You actually had to go to somebody's office to find it. So it took a while to collect. We used to have it up on our website when we first launched in June 2020. We didn't have many people ask for it, so I think we took that down. But yeah, we'd be happy to talk with people about how they want to use that. It is a wonderful database, and the way it works in the model is that the design spec of the system, and say it's a levee and pump system to protect a neighborhood. If it's designed to protect against the 1 in 100-year flood, then it will, the 1 in 100-year flood, that intensity of flooding will be removed in the model. It'll be moved outside of where the levee is. If the water gets too high, if the intensity is too high and the levee overtops, then the feature stops working, and then everything inside that feature would be flooded within the model. So the important thing to note there is that it's working to design spec. We are not modeling the operation, the humans that are operating those pumps and those levee systems. We're not modeling their day-to-day operations, but we're just going to maximum design spec.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, there's been a handful of questions about data access and subscriptions, and the questions are around what's available in the subscription in terms of API access, hazard layers, bulk data. So they're essentially, people are wondering how can they get a hold of the data and how can they access it?
Yeah. So the easiest thing to do is to go to riskfactor.com if you're an individual and you're just trying to look at what's at potential risk for my home itself or the home that I'm looking to buy. If you're a real estate professional, there's a number of subscribers that actually use this as a benefit to their business. So I'm an insurance agent and I'm trying to help people understand why they should procure insurance, or why there might be this risk transfer product that I would like to try and explain the benefits of to my customer. I can use their home and send them that report so that they can understand it. So if you create a subscription, you can send results to as many people as you want with the share button. Or if you're a commercial user and you want to access commercial properties, you can do the same thing on Risk Factor, where you can look them up individually. So there's another tier that's for commercial properties versus residential, but the same concept applies, where all this data is available at the property level, and we make it in a very easy and digestible format for you to use. But then, as I was just mentioning, there are other ways to access this data in bulk, through custom portfolios, through our API. Anyone who's interested in that, please reach out at bd@firststreet.org, and we're happy to answer all of your questions there. And that's just a more nuanced answer depending on what you're trying to do, and we can get you set up with the data from there.
And it looks like we're out of time.
Okay. Well, thank you as always, everyone. It's always fun to do these webinars because we think, there's our customer base and they're asking us questions, but then you get on here and there's thousands of people listening to our conversations that are pretty nerdy about climate and methodological approaches and statistical models and AI. So it makes us feel great that there's so many people interested in what we're doing. We're happy to answer any more questions. If you send them in to us at support@firststreet.org, we're happy to get to those. And as mentioned at the beginning, we'll send out an email to anyone who may have missed this webinar or people who want to watch it again. And you'll have that in your inbox shortly, along with the slides that went through this presentation. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And we are close to the weekend, so hopefully everyone has a great weekend as well. We'll see you later.